Pastor Ben from Trinity United Methodist Church. So there are those moments in time where you are just doing your thing and you're not really thinking much of it. It's not so much that you're asleep to doing it as much as you are simply unaware of its overall impact. My first year in seminary, the theater company at Asbury Theological Seminary had put on a play called The Diviners by Jim Leonard Jr. Funny enough, it was actually written at my undergrad at Hanover College, and I remember taking classes in the very room that The Diviners was being written in. To me, I was just doing what I had been doing for 6 years by that point in time. I was just doing what I had been training to do in a very real sense for the previous 4 years of my life, all throughout undergrad. I had auditioned for a play, I'd gotten a part in the play, so I was acting in the play. And to me, I was just doing my thing. I wasn't thinking about any overall big picture. I was playing a 15-year-old with likely autism who had just lost his mother. And over the course of the show, Buddy is the character's name, is struggling with the grief and the loss of his mother, alongside struggling with the grief and the loss that his sister and his father are dealing with. But it wasn't until the show was over. You hear and you know about a cathartic experience that the theater has for a lot of individuals. But I wasn't really thinking about that. I was just doing my thing, not really asking the questions, not thinking big picture. It wasn't until after opening night, when the cast was out in the narthex area of the chapel where the play had been put on, that one of my fellow students had come up to me and thanked me and shared with me that some of the same questions and griefs and emotional struggles that my character had portrayed were the same ones that she herself had been dealing with after she lost her own mother. To me, I was just doing my thing. But sometimes we don't realize the bigger picture impact that we have on the world around us or in the people around us. When we look to the Old Testament passage in Samuel from this morning's liturgy, that's where we find Samuel. He is caught up in something that was bigger than he was. I mean, here was an instance that was beginning to shape the whole people of God. Yet Samuel didn't realize it. I mean, he was just a kid. He was just doing what he was told to do. There wasn't a whole lot of reflection here on Samuel's part. He didn't understand that bigger picture or what was going on behind the scenes, and certainly wasn't perceiving what was underneath the daily duties that he was performing. It's almost like the movie The Karate Kid, where Mr. Miyagi is having Daniel do all these menial tasks around the house, like waxing his car, wax on, wax off. And it's not until later on in the movie Daniel realizes that these same menial tasks had some of the same foundational movements for the very karate moves that he would need later on in the movie. For Samuel, all he knew is that he was following the direction of Eli, the high priest at the time, his mentor who was going blind and can no longer do many of these things himself. He needed the help. Samuel sought to do what he was told. He didn't take advantage of the station that he was placed in like Eli's biological children had. But no matter what was happening around Samuel, he just did it. He was just doing his duties. He was just following directions. So this story that we have from the lectionary for this morning, this story starts out by stating the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Now, I'm not going to lie, this certainly doesn't seem to be a very positive way to start a story that takes place inside the temple of the Lord. But there you have it. Samuel's days were filled with countless details and tasks that Eli could no longer perform himself due to his sight being increasingly lost. The rituals that were supposed to guide God's people, he could no longer do himself. Except now, in this case, God's people didn't have a proper shepherd because the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Which leads to an interesting question. If the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and people weren't being given that direction that they needed to have, what did they turn to? What authority or authorities or influences did they go to? Did they distract themselves by obsessing over practices or obsessing over people or obsessing over habits? What voices did they listen to? Human beings, we're built almost needing direction. We're built needing a purpose. Have you ever felt directionless yourself and how disquieting that is? Living your life without direction is a pointless way to live as well as exhausting. Without direction, you find yourself blowing whichever way the wind blows. Without direction, you become unsure about your own self-worth. You become unsure about your ambition, and hope gets emptied out over time. It gets exhausting because you think, well, that person wants me to do this, and that person wants me to do that, and so I'm going to try to do both at the same time, and it's not going to work out for me too well, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. So when the word of the Lord was rare in that time, or when we feel like the word of the Lord is rare today, what are we supposed to do? Make and determine our own direction? Are we just left to our own devices? Who knows? Perhaps, instead of looking at it as my life is directionless and meaningless, because I can't hear God's voice right now, maybe this is an invitation for us to listen deeper. Is there something to hear in the midst of all of this after all? We live in a society, in a world that conveys this idea of what you see is what you get. So when you don't see it, well, you obviously don't get it, right? When you don't see it, we're left to assume that it's not there at all. There's nothing to get. However, even though the word of the Lord is rare, even though those that were supposed to speak for the Lord are going blind, we still see that the lamp of God has not yet gone out. This seems to indicate that even though we may have given up on God, God hasn't given up on us. The voice still calls. We might feel night in our souls. We might feel this darkness of doubt and fear and emptiness overwhelming us at times. But we find that the voice still calls. That's what our faith tells us when our ears are weary of listening to the silence. That sounds interesting. That sounds true enough. I suppose it is. And after all, how many of us feel uncomfortable in silence nowadays? Well, part of that discomfort in the midst of silence also has to do with this concept that today there's more and more noise and more distractions than ever before. I remember going to high school back in the early 2000s. And I remember how much of a slower, quieter pace that was than today. I can't imagine all of the things that high schoolers today are dealing with. There are so many more distractions, so many more things vying for our attention, so many more new things that sometimes I don't even know where to start. I sometimes feel overwhelmed at where to begin. So I guess the question is there really silence anymore? Maybe we're not hearing the word of the Lord because the world that we are in happens to be so loud that we're hearing everything else. Our world is littered with distractions, with voices that are calling and blaming and warning and vying for our attention. It's loud in our souls where we have allowed our fears and questions and doubts to take up space. We've all done it. How many of you have felt overwhelmed from the not knowing, overwhelmed from the doubts and the fears, from the negative self-talk that you've allowed to take up in your head? How many of you have felt overwhelmed and like the insides of you are just screaming out loud because of your insecurities, because of your inadequacies, because of your failures? And you've allowed those failures to define you. It is so loud that we don't hear the voice anymore. The very voice that leads and comforts us. The voice that challenges and guides us. We don't hear the voice anymore because we stopped listening. Or if we do hear it, we can't discern it from all of the other voices around us. In that instance, can we really be surprised that Samuel thought that it was Eli calling out his name in the middle of the night? Because he didn't have the ability to discern whose voice it was that he was hearing. He just assumed it must be Eli. Is it really a surprise then when we mix up the voice with that of a spouse or a friend? Maybe with a book that we've read or a song that we've heard? It's because we've forgotten how to listen, not just to, but even for the voice. Samuel keeps waking up Eli in the middle of the night like my 4-year-old likes to come on in and wake me up because he wants to sleep on the floor in my room, cuddled up in the comforter that has since taken up residence on the floor, all right? Samuel keeps coming in, waking up Eli in the middle of the night, and finally, it hits Eli what is going on. It takes him a moment because his own life has been filled with insecurities and concerns, and I'm going blind and I can't fully do my job anymore. I have to rely on this kid to do everything for me, So his own inner self was in turmoil and was loud inside. So it took him a moment to remember how the voice talks to us because he had forgotten himself. It's at this point that Eli finally begins to mentor Samuel. Finally. No longer is Samuel just for the grunt work. He's got an ear to hear the word of the Lord. So it's time to start teaching him how to listen to it, how to listen for it. So Eli introduces Samuel to this voice and he names that source Lord. He instructs Samuel to say, "Speak, Lord." That's what you say. That's the beginning of putting yourself within hearing distance of the voice. Identifying the source that you are hearing is an important step in the process because it begins to put you where you belong and it begins to put God where God belongs. "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." That is what you say, is what Eli tells Samuel. You say to the voice, "I know who you are. I know who I am, and I want to hear what you have to say. I want to be led. I want to be taught. I want to be claimed." That is what Eli is beginning to teach Samuel here. And this is a process that takes time for any of us, to get used to. When Samuel first addresses this voice, he says, "Speak, your servant is listening." An okay first attempt. He forgets to properly identify the voice. But you know what? That's okay. It's fine. It takes time to get anything new completely right to begin with. At least it's coming from a servant's heart. That's what matters. When we head over to the gospel reading from today's lectionary, it's obvious that Nathanael wasn't listening. His ears were so full of the world's commonplace wisdom of the day. Wisdom. He knew who he was. He knew who was in and who was out. He could recognize a scam, something too good to be true when it came along. It might be because he himself had suffered, been the victim of a decent amount of scams himself, had been taken advantage of and burned as well. All he knew was what he heard from everybody else, that nothing good comes from the sticks. Nothing good comes from the north. Nothing good comes from Galilee. He knew where he could hear something worth listening to and where he was wasting his time. And so when Philip invites him and gushes over this Jesus guy from Galilee, Nathanael's skeptical. Because Galilee, the countryside, that is not where anything good worth listening to comes from. That's what he believed. That's what he had been told. But here's something interesting, though. He still goes. He was sure there wasn't anything special in this man from Galilee, and yet the cynical man still went. It may have been due to his friend asking him to come along. So, okay, fine. Solidarity, support, whatever. Maybe I can just laugh at you later. Or maybe behind his cynical shell, there was still an ear willing to listen to a voice that would speak into the emptiness that he felt. Another possibility, despite that gruff exterior, maybe he still had enough hope that hadn't been completely snuffed out yet, hadn't been quite buried yet by those doubts. Maybe that's what caused him to shuffle along behind Philip to hear Jesus speak. And although he grumbled all the way there, you can't help but think that there wasn't a very real part of him that really wanted this Jesus fella to be the real deal. If that's not the case, how do you explain his sudden 180-degree turnaround? Going from nothing good comes from Galilee to a statement of faith that he's going to be making in just a few moments. When Nathanael shows up, Jesus says something odd to him. Here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. Of course, this question comes out of Nathanael's mouth because the statement obviously hit a chord in him. It's a strange statement, but it's something that meant a good deal to Nathanael, evidently, because Nathanael asked the question, how do you know me? It might be that one of Nathanael's core tenets was to be a man who was honest, was to be a man of integrity, was to be a man who could identify the lies around him. Whatever the case may be, what Jesus says here, here's a man without any deceit in him. It strikes a chord, and Nathanael wants to know, how do you know this about me? And Jesus replies with a seemingly equally odd statement. Per Jesus' way, I saw you under the fig tree. One could conjecture that's not really an answer. Or maybe, it was an instance where Nathanael remembered this moment in time that was life-altering for him. A moment in time where his thoughts and his feelings and his emotions and his trying to identify who he was in life came together and culminated in this experience under a fig tree. So maybe Jesus was speaking to this moment that helped to set Nathanael on the course that he was on. Whatever the case may be, this statement leads Nathanael to making a confession of faith. Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. No matter the reasoning, whatever brought about that confession, we realize that Nathanael heard something that he was listening for, that he had been desperately wanting to hear for so long. It wasn't quite a "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening" statement, but this exchange certainly turned his life around. Perhaps a lesson here is that we shouldn't be going around and making assumptions. Probably shouldn't be doing that anyway. Because enough of us have made fools of ourselves doing as such. But we have all too often looked around at our community thinking to ourselves that most, if not all, of these individuals that I see don't want anything to do with us, don't want anything to do with the message that we convey. We say to ourselves, they don't care about our message, they don't want to belong or connect with us. And as a result of that assumption, we tell ourselves that we needn't bother because we already know how it will go. Perhaps Samuel and Nathaniel have a different message for us. Maybe through them, maybe through their story, we learn that we need to keep speaking, to keep inviting, to keep telling our story. Because at the end of the day, who knows? Who knows how many people might actually hear it? Might actually hear a message of hope. At the end of the day, we might find ourselves realizing that someone really was listening to even the most random thing that we had to share. Maybe that message or story that we thought just bombed, that no one in their right mind should have appreciated or understood. Maybe that was the exact story that they needed to find their hope reignited. So may we be a people who position ourselves in such a way to receive what God has to share. A people that are willing and able to say to the voice, as we're learning to listen to the voice, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." God bless.